us, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. Really excited for our panel tonight on rethinking justice, criminal legal reform in Montana. This panel is part of our 15th Women's Policy Leadership Institute. WPLI is a program of Montana Women Vote, and Montana Women Vote is a statewide organization of low-income women and families, LGBT folks, trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks, Black, Indigenous, and people of color and their allies, working for policy reform and to engage in the democratic process. We're really grateful, and I am very excited to have our presenters with us tonight. Some real smarty pants here to share their thoughts and experience with us tonight. I want to go over a few tech notes as we get started. This is a Zoom webinar style event, so everyone who's joining, you are automatically muted and your video is disabled, so you can participate primarily through the chat and the Q&A box. We will be recording tonight, so we're going to go ahead and get that recording started. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question using your audio, you can do so in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, a little microphone icon, or by pressing *6 if you're joining us on the phone. If there are folks who are unmuted and there's background noise, we might go ahead and mute you just to make sure everybody can hear. And we do encourage folks to use the chat and the question and answer box. It's a good way to make sure you can share your thoughts and your questions, and we can keep the panel running smoothly. You can talk directly with other panelists through that chat function. You can get to the chat on the bottom of your screen. There's a little text bubble, and if you click it, a chat box will pop up, and at the top there's a blue bar that says "to," and if you click that, you'll see the names of folks who are attending. So if there's somebody you want to connect with, maybe somebody doing work in your area, you can use that chat box to chat directly with them. We do ask that folks be respectful, and we are monitoring chats and questions to make sure that everybody follows those rules. If you have any technical problems at all, put that down in the chat, or you can call us at 406-317-1505. And last tech note, we are going to put an evaluation link in the chat at the end of the session. We ask that you take a minute to fill that evaluation out. We really do read all of those evaluations. They're important to us. And every time you fill out a WPLI evaluation this year, we're going to enter your name into a raffle to win a prize, either a gift card or a great book of poetry by Heather Cahoon. So thanks in advance for taking a minute to fill that out. One last note, we do have closed captions available. So again, at the bottom of your screen, there's a box that says CC, and you can click that to turn captions on or off and to adjust the size of the captions as well. So that's all our tech notes. We're gonna go ahead and jump in. Again, really excited for this conversation about justice and safety. Today, we're going to be talking about the ways that our criminal legal system works and doesn't work in Montana. Some of the both proactive and defensive work that's happening in the legislature right now around criminal legal reform, and some of our sort of bigger picture and more visionary ideas about what safety and justice might look like. I'm really excited to introduce Zuri Moreno, Laurel Hess, and Kelson Young, our panelists tonight. And instead of reading bios, I thought that I might just ask all of you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work, and tell us a little bit about what justice and safety mean to you. Zuri, do you want to take us away?
Absolutely. Yeah, my name is Zuri Moreno, and my pronouns are they, them. And I had never really thought of myself as a community organizer, but I guess I'm a community organizer. And I focus a lot on policy change. And I guess I got involved in this work by asking a lot of annoying questions. And that's from the beginning. Like before I was like officially involved in the work, you just ask my parents so many annoying questions about why we do things the way we do things, and is it working? Does it work for people? And specifically, I got involved in criminal justice reform work through being a policy associate with the ACLU up until this last fall. And I currently work with the Montana Budget and Policy Center. But a lot of my work also is in the community, working with other organizers and formerly incarcerated justice-involved folks throughout the state, really trying to support work that they're doing in their communities or at the statewide level. So that's a little bit of background. I really also want to note that I try to focus and uplift the intersectionality in the criminal justice system and how certain folks are disproportionately impacted. And I think if that's an okay intro, I'll go into justice and safety. Great. So justice and safety. I mean, I've already mentioned that I got into this work by asking a lot of annoying questions. And, due to my upbringing, the idea of justice didn't really work for me. It came, when I was a kid, I understood justice from my parents. Our first teachers are our guardians or our family and our friends. And it was this a real eye for an eye, vengeful, like you take from me, I take from you sort of justice. And that didn't work for me. And I mention this not to like get down on anyone who believes in that form of justice, but to sort of shape, like, this is where I started. I started with an idea of vengeful justice. And that's sort of where I've built my definition of justice from. I asked my family again, and so many of my peers and my friends, and then my teachers, like, why do we do what we do? Is the process working? Is it making things right? Because that's what I was told. Don't worry, I'm going to get to my definition in a second instead of what my definition isn't. But really, my definition was about how do we ease suffering? How do we reestablish resources? Or if there are, legal folks on here, like, how do we make someone or a group of folks whole? How do we make you whole when you have had injustice done to you? You've been harmed, or your family's been harmed, or your community's been harmed. And so, I do want to mention, like, of course, my poor parents, who are both survivors, were working within the system that had been handed to them, right? So I'm not at all throwing my parents under the bus here, or anyone in my family. And that system didn't work for me. It wasn't a system that when I looked at it, I said, people are being restored. People are, finding safety and finding transformation from what has happened. And so, I define justice as a system that will elevate and prioritize healing, a system that interrupts, this perpetuation of harm. Harm has happened. And I feel like in our punitive system, it's just a continued perpetuation of that. And this type of justice system is holistic, and it's also complex, right? Like, if it sounds complicated to you, I agree, it feels complicated to me. And it feels so important to interrupt harm. And, I think that because it sounds complex, the easier route with injustice can just be taking the snapshot of when someone commits a crime and passing a judgment on just that snapshot, and then handing out what sometimes is a punitive sentence in a disjointed response. But I don't actually think that this easier approach of taking the snapshot and passing judgment on it creates easier lives for any of us, whether you are the person who committed the crime, or you are the survivor, or you're the community witnessing it. I don't think it makes anything easier. I think it makes everything harder for us. So justice needs to be holistic. It needs to be about restoring. And many people, to bridge it into safety, cite the idea of, cite safety implications when it comes to the idea of restorative justice and a restorative response. And I want to quickly say, from my own personal experience, I am the kid of an immigrant family, and they're brown immigrants with thick accents. And I have never, as a trans and queer individual, felt that the police provided me or my family safety. That's my own personal experience. And I know that there are many folks who share that personal experience. And I don't think that incarceration provides us safety either. You don't have to take my firsthand experience on this. We have an entire history of the police system that demonstrates how it's built on violence and oppression. And we have years and years of activism from groups from Black Lives Matter and other groups raising awareness around police brutality, racial profiling, and inhumane practices and conditions within our carceral system, as well as years of data around recidivism. And sorry, that's sort of a jargony word. That just means when someone commits a crime and they were incarcerated and then they get out of jail or prison, recidivism is like if they commit a new crime, they recidivated. And also, folks on the call, if there's a better way to define that, please let me know. It's a hard word, but I think that the carceral system doesn't work for us. So many people who are in it are struggling, and I think that safety is really about. So I should say policing and incarceration are about protecting capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. And safety truly is about providing resources to the community that we need. So that if, I forgot to ask if this is okay, I'm just going to dive right in. So if it's a shit year in your life and you can't afford rent and you can't buy your groceries, or like you need access to more in-depth healthcare, like that's safety, is providing that for you, and making sure that we can create stability in your life, in your family's life, in your community. And I guess I'll get into more of this later, but like safety is long-term stable investment in all these systems that make sure that we can, stay stable and stay whole. I'm going kind of long. Sorry. Do I need to stop?
Yeah, let's take a Laurel, I saw that. Let's take a pause there. I mean, thank you so much for that, Zuri. I feel like that's a lot to think about right there. Laurel, do you want to take a moment to also introduce yourself and your thoughts on safety and justice?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Laurel Hess, my pronouns are she, her. I'm also described as a community organizer, which is a new label for me. Right now, I am a legislative program manager with the ACLU of Montana. Previously, I worked for Missoula County in doing pretrial reform, specifically dealing with pretrial risk assessments, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But I entered into an interest in criminal legal reform through providing direct services for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, working at a shelter actually in Missoula. I saw a system that was not working in my mind, but actually at the time I was coming from a framework of carceral feminism. So actually wanting increased penalties, increased prosecution for people who are committing these crimes. And I will say that my understanding of justice and safety has come a really, really long way from there. But I think it's really important to acknowledge, whether it's from our family, our culture, whatever privileges we're bringing to our experiences of whether the justice system is quote unquote working for us or not, or where we're coming from, it's really important to acknowledge wherever our baseline understanding of definitions come from. And I now, through a lot of new exposure and a lot of studying and a lot of reading, and I'm absolutely 100% still learning and adding to these definitions. But if you saw me, I was nodding my head a lot when Zuri was talking. So I won't repeat too much, but believe that justice can absolutely and often does more holistically exist outside of the justice system as we understand it. And what that looks like is identifying root causes. It can absolutely involve and, you know, should involve holding people accountable, but really focusing on addressing the root cause, which is oftentimes violence. And I think it can absolutely, like I said, exist outside of these punitive systems that are really built to maintain power and control over people, and that those punitive systems, as Zuri was saying, that is their function. That's what they were built to do. That's what they're still doing. And it involves, I think justice involves a lot of imagination. It can be so outside of culturally what we even know or see to exist now. But it can be so much more expansive than the definitions that our culture really provides us with. And leading into safety, again, similar to what Zuri said, I really believe that safety looks like communities and individuals being well resourced. And I actually think that Zuri said it so well. I don't think I can say it much better, but really giving communities and individuals an opportunity to thrive. And I think in those instances, that really is where we are seeing less violence. And I think that's all I have. Kelson?
Thank you, Laurel. Kelson, take us away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kelson Young, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm coming to you from my home office in East Helena, Montana. I am huge fans of both Laurel and Zuri and Montana Women Vote. And so first, I just want to say that I feel honored and a real sense of privilege to even be a part of this conversation. My identities that I come to this conversation are many. And so, yes, my current employment is that I'm the executive director of the Montana Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. And I can't tell you how many times I've said that title because I am currently at, I think, my 16th year with the organization. And for at least the last 8 legislative sessions, I've been our primary lobbyist with some help, depending on the session. And so I have said that many, many times. And most importantly for me is that I come here with the identity of being a mother, being a stepmom, and being a grandma. And those identities have really impacted my view and my relationship to the terms that we're discussing. I also come as a survivor. I come as someone who experienced both sexual and domestic violence. And I come as someone who comes from a very different time than the world we live in right now. The 80s seem like a long time ago to many, but as someone who was a child of the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, so much is different about the world today. And so I feel privileged that I've been in this work of anti-violence since I was 19 years old. Back in 1997, I started volunteering at the YWCA Missoula. And next thing you know, I've spent my career trying to end violence. So you can imagine that a lot has changed in that time. I was thinking, Laurel, you were just talking about how much your perspective has changed in the last, 2 to 3 years, I would guess. Mine too. 20 years ago, we looked at our work very different. We were just starting to become federally funded. The term carceral feminism is really a result of white women like me who do this work, who invested deeply in the criminal justice system as the solution to domestic and sexual violence. Although even at the time, we knew that it wasn't the answer. It was just one piece, but it was like a way of trying to bring credibility and attention to an issue that had been pervasive in our culture and yet unaddressed. And so while we were saying so many of the things that Laurel and Zuri just talked about in terms of a holistic system, holistic responses to survivors of trauma, what we got was, well, you can call the police and you might be able to get an order of protection. And all of this energy and resources for both domestic and sexual violence victim has been poured into the criminal justice system as the answer. So, a couple of caveats I want to give is, number one, I will be speaking at times tonight about our relationship to this issue as an organization. And when you've been the director, as long as I have, people sort of think it's one and the same, that like I am my job and vice versa. But the reality is what we've been able to accomplish, the direction we're moving as an organization, is obviously driven by some of my personal experience, but I am way more, let's say, on the edge than a lot of my colleagues, mostly because of some lived experience I've had. And so at times I will be offering perspective mostly based on some of that personal experience and perspective, as opposed to, an official statement on behalf of the Montana Coalition. I appreciate everything Laurel and Zuri said, and literally, Zuri, you described the world I want to live in. So thank you for that. When I thought about these two words, I did not have that level of creativity in my brain at the time. So my definitions of justice were elusive, completely self-defined. Justice, in my experience, has not been served by our systems. And so I'm not really sure how much more time I want to engage my life in trying to fix systems that don't work for humans. And it's a real challenge when your day-to-day work is about changing those systems. So I'm ready to transform them. And I really think that collective community healing is where it's at, as opposed to all of these carceral systems and on behalf of the people kind of thing about our justice system. So I'm deeply invested and involved in that conversation about creating that new world that we want to live into. And I think that justice and safety right now are completely distinct and different from what those things feel like in that worldview. Same thing for safety. I guess I just wanted to say, as a white privileged person, that safety is an illusion. It's completely dependent on position in society. It's completely dependent upon access to resources, financial privilege. I think as a white person, as Zuri was saying, law enforcement was built to protect white people. And so as systems of response, when our systems are inherently racist, then the concept of safety within that system is going to feed the need of mostly white people with economic privilege. So that's how I'm feeling about those words today, Howell, but I'm hoping that at some point I'll have the opportunity to really spend time and energy with colleagues like you have on this panel to move this conversation even further, because I think that when we're just trying to scratch off the edges, we're not doing what we really need to do to transform this system.
Thank you, Kelson. Thank you, all three of you. I wanted to start off by getting a chance to think and talk a little bit more broadly about these concepts and visions of safety and justice. And now I want to pivot a little bit and actually get specific about some of the perhaps incremental and reformist, but still very important policy fights that we have in front of us during the legislative session. So Zuri, I want to turn back to you. You've done your fair share of lobbying on criminal legal reform now. Can you tell us a little bit about any trends you're seeing in the legislative session or any specific bills that you want to lift up? And Laurel and Kelson, I would say jump in as well with specific bills that you'd like to raise. And I also want to say two quick things. One, someone noted in the chat that when we on the panel speak quickly, it's a little hard for the closed captioning to keep up. So there's a moment for us to all take a breath and slow down. And then secondly, there was a great question, and I'll put it out here now for us to get to in this policy conversation, about the ban on federal funding for private prisons, one of President Biden's executive orders, and how that might affect criminal justice in Montana. So we can hold on to that and get to it. Zuri, you want to talk to us a little bit about the session?
Absolutely. I will say that, just to quickly note, that the work that I do around criminal justice stuff is really focused on individuals' rights and maintaining basic human rights for folks who are impacted by the criminal justice system. So just want to quickly note that. So that's the place that I'm talking from when I talk about trends or bills that I really think you should follow. And, you know, I really want to hear from Laurel and Kelson on this as well. And we've all been able to be in the Capitol building and hear chatter in different ways. And kind of what I'm hearing this year is maybe some kind of good news from the governor's office, that there's going to be investment in mental health and substance use treatment. I don't know if that's going to be a reality, but exactly. You know, we're hearing that chatter, hopefully, right? That we actually see that materialize, that investment happen. There's also really harmful legislation moving around increased penalties for driving under the influence. There is reinstating the death penalty by use of inhumane execution, and removing prisoners from being covered by the Montana Human Rights Act, just to name a couple. And so I think that what, it's also happening, sorry, this just feels like kind of bad news, but the governor and conservative legislators want to cut the public defender budget and change how folks are eligible to receive a public defender. So I actually am going to lean a little bit more on Kelson and Laurel for this. You know, in 2017, there was a slew of bills that were passed that was due to the hard work of lobbyists and advocates and community organizers that brought about some justice reinvestment initiative. And that's really coming up a lot in conversations, and not a great way in this session. And implementation was hard once those passed, like judges and county attorneys and, you know, folks across the state were like, I don't want to implement this. So it's even more challenging to hear those same folks come in and be like, this isn't working. So that's also unfortunate. I don't know, Kelson or Laurel, if you want to talk a little bit about that justice reinvestment.
I mean, I think you covered it well in the sense of it started with wonderful intentions, really bipartisan effort over an extended period of time. 2017 is when much of the legislation moved, but for the interim before that, there was this thing called the Sentencing Commission, which was basically the entity that looked at the problems we had and then working with the Council on State Governments came up with the proposals that were put forth in 2017. But it's kind of like anything, a good idea doesn't mean diddly if you don't fund it and if people aren't bought in to the concept on the ground. So what we saw was really never did the Prosecutors Association, the sheriff and police officers, the sort of criminal justice folks on the ground buy into the concepts that the state was putting forth. And so even the things that were put in place have been a matter of discussion, right? So if you don't have consensus that these are things that we want to do, then you don't have people on the ground necessarily doing it the way that it would work if it was with good intention and sort of from that place of this is what we were planning to do, right? So I think we've just never funded it and we've not had the buy-in at the local level for the people that really affect the policies to make that difference. And it's one of those things where it's a catch-22 because now that we've done it, some people get to say, oh, well, we tried that and it didn't work. And so it actually deeply hurts what I would consider real criminal justice reform concepts, abolition concepts, you know, things where we're actually moving the needle are going to be harder to have because this thing was done half-assed, right? And because now we have, oh, well, it didn't work. It's a false narrative, but what else is new, right? False narratives are what we deal with in that building all day. So that's my take on it. I mean, I just think it has the potential to continue to negatively impact us if we don't figure out ways to capitalize on the things that the Gianforte administration is going to do. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm the last person to jump on the Gianforte train. I will say that publicly. But if the efforts around co-occurring issues and like really addressing the needs of mental health and substance abuse is a result of this Republican administration, that will be a starting point, right? Like, I hope that that's what happened. I just told somebody today, I'm way too cynical to believe that that will happen yet. But I think unless we start meaningfully invest in those response systems, we're not going to see the change that we had hoped for.
Thank you both. That actually is a great segue, Laurel, to a question we have for you. You've done work at the sort of local implementation level, seeing how policies like pretrial assessments actually get implemented in a community and what that looks like when it goes from the policy world to the sort of boots on the ground world. Can you tell us a little bit about, you know, what you think folks should understand about that implementation process and some of the challenges you've seen?
Yeah, thanks for that. It was really interesting to work on some of those justice reinvestment bills with the ACLU in 2017, and then have the opportunity once one of them specifically became law to work at the county level. And I believe that Kelson was really spot on, and Zuri as well. The buy-in was never there. And so the tool that I worked on was kind of sold to Montana as a potential alternative or way to reduce inequities when it comes to the pretrial system, specifically our reliance on cash bail. And so jurisdictions are using algorithmic risk assessments, which I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible, but use criminal history data like arrest records, convictions, charges to predict someone's likelihood of not appearing for court or their likelihood of reoffending if they are released pretrial. And so judges use that to help inform their release decisions. It's really difficult to run a robust, what's supposed to be evidence-based, data-informed policy program, and this was a pilot project, without the infrastructure. And the state thought, you know, we kind of all are coming, hopefully, to an understanding that our cash bail system is creates a two-tiered system, a justice system for people who can pay and people who can't, and that we want to move away from that. But what replaces that is really important, and it can either be a transformation or it can be a lateral shift and repackaging. And I'm of the belief that pretrial risk assessments are the latter, unfortunately. And without really consistent data collection across all of the participating pilot counties, there's no way to adequately and accurately measure, collect performance measures on what the tool was doing. And I think a lot of reforms, if not implemented in this framework of having an end goal of reducing the footprint of the justice system, really are just end up maintaining the status quo. And so I think that it was a misinformed, not applicable reform or doable for Montana, because we simply didn't have the infrastructure to run a robust program like that and really monitor the outcomes accurately. I also want to say that I think that before implementation, any reform that is not identified by impacted communities and justice involved folks probably isn't going to really be much, isn't going to yield much transformative change. And that also, my understanding, was not a part of the picture. And involved and impacted folks should be at every decision point, and not just there, not included as an afterthought, but really given equal power in identifying what needs are, what solutions are, and whether something is working. And that is just was been completely absent. And I think not having buy-in, you can pass a law, but if you don't have buy-in from the people who are implementing it, it's never going to work. And data that measures outcomes is only as good as what you're putting in. It's garbage in, garbage out. And it's really hard to tell if something's working under those circumstances, much less reducing a jail population, which was supposed to be the goal.
Thank you. Okay, Kelson, I want to move on to a question for you, and I've got a question for you, and there's a question from the participants, and I think actually they might go hand in hand. So I'm going to ask you both at the same time. So we often see survivors of crime, and especially women, used to justify increased policing and incarceration. We are seeing that every day at the session right now. In your experience, what do survivors actually need to move towards safety and justice? And then also a question from the audience. For folks who are advocates, what kind of resources do you recommend to educate oneself on the sort of carceral feminism that you mentioned, and how to empower clients in a more productive way, you know, apart from that?
Thank you for the question, Hal. And if there's a topic I'm more passionate about than this, then let me know what that is. And I have no doubt that Laurel and Zuri have things to add too. So the first thing I will say, and I just, you know, I don't want to belabor the point, but survivors are not all the same. And one of my absolute sort of picky things is people are always asking me, well, what do survivors need? Every single survivor I've ever known or worked with needs something different. And so one of the things that's really important is some survivors come from that frame of reference of the kind of justice that Zuri described they were brought up on, right? So like the idea that an eye for an eye, revenge, punishment, the reality is that if you've suffered a trauma at the hands of another person, there is a process that happens that allows you to reconcile how you're still going to live in that world with that other person in the world. And so, the idea that all survivors want people locked up and the key thrown away and all that, it's just not ever been my experience. A few survivors I know want their perpetrator of whatever the trauma was to spend time incarcerated. Mostly they have wanted them to spend time incarcerated so that they don't hurt other people. The overwhelming principle I hear from survivors is, I don't want what happened to me to happen to someone else. They don't actually generally want the person that hurt them to be harmed. Now, that there's obviously a differential there if the person that harmed them is someone they loved or love, or if it's a stranger. And so again, when you talk about survivors of trauma, you can be talking about that full spectrum. Most often, what survivors need is a set of solutions, resources, opportunities, etc., that are very specific to their situation. And the carceral, meaning the criminal justice response to their situation, I can't help myself but talk with my hands, so just know that. The carceral response serves a small purpose in the overall picture of their lives. But what I will say is I've also spent the last 25 years working with people who, some of them have been killed by that person. So we do live in a world where, we don't have the best solution at hand, but we also know that there's people who live in our communities who we are not safe in the world if they are also allowed to roam free. So it's a complicated thing when you've survived trauma at the hands of another person. You don't want them to hurt other people, and you don't want to continue to be at risk of harm from them. And so we haven't, I think, created the solutions that would be most appropriate for that. We actually have forgotten what it looked like when it was a community response, as opposed to, oh, just call law enforcement and they'll fix the problem. People don't know what to do now when somebody they know has been harmed. They don't know what the community, what the family, what the neighborhood response looks like to that harm. So we just expect criminal justice to be the answer. And the reality is, those of us that do victim services, we've always known the criminal justice system was a very small piece of healing, of surviving, of transforming from one circumstance to another. And it really has little to do with a survivor's ability to process that trauma and be in the world in a healthy way again. So I hope that answers the question. Survivors need lots of different things. Safety, in the sense of protection, is sometimes a part of it, but we as a society have decided what we need to do is protect women, when most of the time what women or other people who are subjected to that violence from other people, what most of the time they want is freedom to be and freedom to be autonomous. They don't need more protection. They need the ability to make their own decisions and define their lives for themselves. In terms of what our programs can do, I will just note that for the resources that I included, there is a shift in our movement, both at the state, national, ground level, where we really are trying to move really in some ways back to where we came from, of really trying to find and deeply invest in solutions that don't look like what we've been doing for the last 30 years. And this summer, as a result of the George Floyd murder, coalitions across the country signed on to this thing that is called the Moment of Truth statement. I included that statement as a resource and as a starting point for you to understand that there is movement afront. The other thing I attached was a list of resources, but it's mostly news stories from this summer about this shift that's happening. It's actually been happening within the domestic and sexual violence movement for a while, but it's like now it's public that we're shifting away from focusing on the criminal justice system and really taking account for the racism and white supremacy that's permeated in that system. And, you know, it would be really important for me to say that there's 3 names that I would start with. Mariam Kaba, so Mariame Kaba. Listen to her and you'll be transformed. Anything she does, read it, listen to it. Mimi Kim, Mimi, and then last name Kim. She's also on the resource list. They have been doing this work of creative interventions for decades, and they have like a 1 million-page toolkit, by the way. And then last but not least, for my deep understanding, has been Beth Ritchie, who also has wonderful resources. So those are 3 women of color who have been telling us how we should be doing better for a long time. And people are, you know, finally reckoning and listening. And those are people I would start with for anybody who does victim services, especially.
Thank you so much. I want to just give one more moment for any of the 3 of you to lift up if there's a particular important piece of legislation, could be one of the ones that has been mentioned before, or a different one that you want people to follow or take action or know about this session. And at the same time, I want to ask a policy-specific question from a participant, and this is about the decriminalization of marijuana that was passed by initiative last fall. The question is, as the Montana bill, well, so first, a recommendation from a social equity lens is that marijuana revenue be used to support automatic expungement of marijuana-related records from people's records. The question is, as the Montana bill currently reads, for folks to get their records expunged, they have to petition, which reads as hiring an attorney, something that won't help less privileged Montanans. Is anyone acting on this? So that question, any one of you jump in, and then if all of you would like to lift up a particular piece of legislation, that would be great.
I mean, my first response to the marijuana is that sounds wonderful and way more appropriate than what's being proposed. So, you know, I mean, first of all, you saw me cheering because decriminalizing marijuana is a huge social justice issue, in my opinion, and I'm very happy about it. And with this legislature and this governor, we'll be lucky if we come out of this process with reasonable policy. But as you may have heard, the money from the initiative that will be generated is a major political football, as we call it, this session. And so all those ideas are really good ideas. And I think anybody that has good ideas about how the money should be spent, I know that the initiative had dictated some to environmental, things like that we were talking about last night, Zuri. But I think that Democrats need feedback about what should be done, because Republicans are basically saying, well, we're going to fund substance abuse with this money, and doesn't that make better sense? But there's a lot of association with the belief system around marijuana that is about criminalizing substance use. So, you know, I think it's a difficult policy issue right now just because of the makeup of the legislature. But I will say that people who are trying to resist the total co-optation of that money need good ideas. So I encourage people to send those thoughts. And Zuri, man, you listen to this every day in Section D, so I can't even imagine what else they're coming up with as we speak.
Oh, I don't know if I'm ready to talk about the things that certain legislators have thoughts on around marijuana and substance use. But I actually really appreciate you uplifting, like, get in touch with legislators and tell them, you know, maybe even moderate Republicans around, like, this would be a really good way to use this money. And I will say that I had hoped for that in this initiative and was disappointed that that wasn't a priority. And if it's okay, I'll just jump jump in quickly and say that SB 195, Senate Bill 195, which is sponsored by Senator McGilvery, I think that it showed up in the chat. And I second a comment I saw in the chat on how is this even ethical? It is the bill that removes, it excludes currently incarcerated youth and adults from being covered by the Montana Human Rights Act. What does that look like in real life? If you have someone who needs a wheelchair accessible cell and they're not given one, they have no recourse. If you are experiencing discrimination based on your race in an incarcerated facility, you have no recourse. You know, along those lines, like any group that is protected under the Human Rights Act in Montana, who is in that person's incarcerated, there's just no recourse for them to say like, hey, I'm not being treated well. I can go on my own little soapbox around how people are treated in incarcerated facilities anyway. And it's taking away one tool to try to fix that, even if it is a little bit not as, efficient tool. So happy to provide more information about where and when to testify, but I just think that everyone on this call should flood Senate Judiciary with objections to this. Like, this is not ethical and it should not get passed.
Completely agree. That's one that's coming up soon, and it's one of those things that could fly under the radar, but we're trying to bring attention to it. So thank you, Zuri, for talking about that.
I was going to mention House Bill 244, which Zuri, you already mentioned, but a bill to revise Montana's death penalty laws in a way that would actually allow the state to resume administering lethal injections, which we haven't been doing for some time because of a lawsuit that came from the ACLU. But this would do it's a pretty minor change in language in the law, but would have a huge impact. It would strike the state's current lethal injection requirements and instead put in really, really broad language around the variety of drugs which could be used in Montana to execute people on death row. It would be a huge change, a massive step backward for our state. And I don't know, Zuri has actually been maybe working on it a little bit more directly than I have, but if either of you have anything to add to that, that is one that I think should be on everybody's radar.
So many things are moving so quickly, Hal, through this session, and I know people are feeling a bit overwhelmed. It's hard to remember all of the things that can harm us this session. But I do want to flag one proposal that will be on its way. I haven't checked today, apologies if it's been introduced, but you may remember that Representative Manzella at the time, who is now very unfortunately Senator Manzella, carried a bill last session to basically try to create pretty significant penalties for false reporting of crimes. We fought very hard against that legislation last session, and it made its way all the way through the process and was vetoed by the governor. She is introducing the same legislation this time. And, first of all, we're against it because it criminalizes, reporting, which I don't know why we would want to criminalize reporting. But, obviously for us, it's a concern because so often survivors of trauma, especially sexual trauma, are not believed by the system and so easily could be in a situation where they've reported and, there's very few people who actually report, but let's say somebody does report and for some reason it's the case is not taken, there would be an argument for somehow that was a false report. The same thing would apply for domestic violence or other things. And so we're just very concerned about the impact that will have on an already difficult process for survivors to come forward and report any sort of trauma. I apologize, I don't have the LC. I can look it up if you don't mind me looking at my phone in a second, and then I can say it later. but it is Senator Manzella. If it hasn't been introduced, it will be introduced very soon. And the short title is like crime reporting laws or something. I don't know, Zuri, if you have it memorized because you have a better brain than I do these days. But it's just a nasty thing. And the hearings last session were right after Kavanaugh, and there was a lot of like, well, so many times young men are accused of things that, and sometimes that's absolutely true. And don't get me wrong, many, especially white women, have misused the criminal justice system against men of color. That is a different conversation. This is significant criminal penalties for somebody who has been considered a false report. And we all know that the criminal justice system doesn't believe survivors most of the time now. So I would just like to bring that to everyone's attention, and I'll look up that LC.
Oh, I put the LC in the chat. It's LC 2460.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So we have about 20 minutes left for our conversation here. This is a good prompt for folks, if you've been holding on to a question, to put that in the chat or the Q&A box. We'll try and make sure we get to it. I want to take a minute, though, to think big again and go back to our sort of aspirational or visionary policy change conversation, and ask each of you to maybe share what's one visionary or aspirational policy change that you'd like to see in the future, and why is that important to you? Zuri, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, I want to uplift something that Kelson said earlier around like the changes that we've seen as people learn more and understand more about like what helps our community, and like shifting in policies, right? And that can be really hard because people have to be bought in. And, I'm a student of abolition, right? And I'm not going to predictably say, let's abolish the police and prisons, right? Because we're not there yet. It has to be incremental change, and we have to have buy-in from communities. And I think that we get that buy-in by setting policy change and showing folks, hey, this actually really works for us. This really works for the community. And something that I thought of was crisis response teams and crisis response centers. And currently, if this is also coming from like organizing in Missoula and trying to get this passed for the Missoula city. And, I would talk to business owners downtown who would say, like, I see someone outside, they're in crisis, and I don't know who to call. And the only person I can call is the police, and I don't want to do that anymore. And so this is something that, Missoula said, maybe this could work. Let's get a crisis response team. Let's get a crisis response center. And yes, of course, it got caught up in politics and it didn't come out the other side very well, but they're trying. And I think that actually a long-term investment in these two things, offering an opportunity for folks to call a crisis response team instead of the police when someone is in crisis, will demonstrate to the community that there are other ways to support folks. And I just think a long-term investment in that, in an actual team that doesn't go along with the police or have to have a police escort and all these sorts of things that got messed up in Missoula, would be a great incremental step towards abolition.
Thank you, Zuri. Laurel, what about you?
Mine might not seem very imaginative, but I think it shows how far we have to go. And my background is in pretrial, so that's just sort of where my brain lives when we have these conversations. But I also think it's really important because it shows us some of what our society believes about people who are quote unquote criminals, and who deserves resources and who doesn't. And one thing that I was working on with the county to try and get, and it was shot down actually by our judicial branch, was to get a statewide text messaging system reminding people of their court dates. It's so simple. I get more messages to remind me of when I have a dentist appointment than people do who have very important hearings that they have to show up to. And it's just providing, you know, basic resources to help people succeed on pretrial so that their release, if they are lucky enough to be released, doesn't get revoked and a warrant is put out for their arrest. And I cannot tell you how much fighting tooth and nail even though it is one of the only evidence-based things that we can provide people on pretrial to actually make sure that they show up for court again. It's not threatening them. It's not ankle monitors. It is just providing people with simple reminders of where they need to be when. And that was something we couldn't get broad support for, which was just wild to me. Another thing that I would hope moving toward, if there are conditions for people's release, that they are evidence-based. You know, I think judges are in kind of a tough position because they're elected officials to make decisions to the public that shows that they're doing something, that they're providing safety, even if evidence shows that ankle monitors or over-the-top drug testing doesn't improve safety. It doesn't keep people sober. It doesn't deter people. All it does, it puts more barriers and more opportunities for them to fail while they're out on pretrial. And right now, a lot of people, although they have not been found guilty of anything, they have to pay for that ankle monitor every day. They have to pay for every drug test that they have. And I would really encourage people to take a look at your jail roster in your area. Most of them are online, and really see who is sitting in your jail's pretrial and think about why. And I just hope that we'll get to a point when we can really invest in systems that support people so that they don't get further ingrained and lost and stuck in the system. And pretrial is a really important period that I hope that we'll focus more resources on.
I have a couple random thoughts, so that's what I'll end with tonight is my random thoughts. And I'll tell you the story about what that light change was in a second. Okay, so my first thought is the change that we want to see is happening all around us all the time, both the resistance and the creativity. And so what I've observed over the last 6 months is so much creative energy about what can be. We're having conversations in a way that I just feel like, in my experience, we haven't been able to have. Abolition is even in the, atmosphere, and that just feels amazing. So there's the policy day-to-day, what it looks like at the Montana State Capitol, which is very different than my sort of vision for the future. But there's one more website I want to tell you to go to and hang out on for a little bit. It's called Resonance Network. Let me just pull it up. Oh, darn, I just had it. Anyways, okay, so Google Resonance Network. It is an extension of various groups that have been meeting for the last couple of years to really try to envision this new worldview that is focused on safety and wholeness and community. And there's a campaign that we have been doing through that platform that really is about creating spaces for people to really envision. I think when I think about abolition or transformation of systems, I don't know what the other thing looks like, right? I can't tangibly describe or smell or taste or feel what that new world would look like. And now I've had the opportunity to actually start talking about that with other people who are deeply invested. And I just think there's so much out there right now. If you want to get more involved in those conversations, there's so much room for creation. I think we didn't get here by mistake, and we're not going to get out of it through policy and tweaking. We're going to get out of it by creating a new world, a new way of dealing with harm. And I'm not sure how we get there. I don't know if the systems blow up and then we get there, or we get to transform some other way, but I'm along for the ride to try to create the vision for what that next thing looks like. And then I just want to take a moment to say I'm a mother of someone who's incarcerated, and I'm a sister of someone who has struggled their whole life with addiction and incarceration. And there are so many things that need to be done before we get to the criminal justice system. So most people I know who are part of the criminal justice system did not get there because they just decided to be criminals one day. They are struggling with mental health. They are struggling with a system, a community, everything that doesn't work for them. Somewhere it broke down. And until we actually get to the root causes, as Zuri was saying, about why people cause harm or why people end up incarcerated, everything else is just, sort of going to be eating around the edges, like I said. And meanwhile, people in our systems are suffering. Being incarcerated is a bleak and horrible place most of the time. And there is a lot about it that is not humane. And so anything we can do to try to make that system better in the meantime, we absolutely have to be doing, because it's not going to fix anybody. It's not going to make us feel safe. It's going to continue to be something that people profit off. That's the whole private prison thing. I mean, the reality is most private prisons are under contract. So I don't know how that will work for the state of Montana. Somebody should be asking the Department of Corrections that as we speak. But I do think that the more that people can make money off of incarceration, the more that's going to continue to drive our policy efforts. So we have to be able to resist. As Zuri was saying, I mean, Zuri, seriously, we could have gotten done in the 15 minutes that you opened, because like that's all it, right? So unless we deal with the capitalistic nature of our incarceration system, we're going to be yelling from the outside for a while. That's all I got, Howell.
Well, thank you all. I'm going to take a moment of moderator's privilege here and just add on. I think that, one of my favorite abolitionists, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, wonderful scholar and author and activist, highly recommend her books and podcasts and essays. She really talks about when we think about the criminal legal system as it's set up now is really focused on two things. One, like Zuri said, a single snapshot in time when usually one person does harm to another person or group of people. And thinking much more broadly about who folks are and the conditions in people's lives when they're engaging in any kind of activity that could cause harm, including violence, is important. But then secondly, really taking a step back from that focus on the individual level, because the truth is that individuals can and do cause harm, but so do systems and so do institutions. And those systems and institutions that create harm are the foundation of what starts people into a cycle of incarceration, as well as mental health crisis, substance use disorder, et cetera, et cetera. And so I do think that thinking big picture, not just about the work we do that impacts people at an individual level, but also the work to chip away at the systems and structures that create harm, and that put us all into a difficult cycle of trying to reimagine what could be next. All really important and related. I don't see any pending questions from the chat. So any last words from you panelists before we take a moment to wrap up? Okay.
I will just.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Sorry. I do want to say, I've been following the chat, and there was a comment around, consider how you talk about incarcerated people with your friends and family. And I think that this is so important part of this is also changing a narrative around how we talk about folks who are impacted by the criminal justice system. And I think that a lot of the bills that we see, these unethical bills, come from this idea that people who are in the criminal legal system don't have rights anymore, that we are empowered to take those away. And just really consider, where does that idea come from? How does it play out in our policy, and how can we interrupt that and create a whole new narrative around how everyone deserves basic human rights? And I have resources that I can share for that stuff too, but really appreciate so much hearing the resources that Kelson shared. Thank you. Thank you. I'm gonna grab all of those.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone. We just put the link to the evaluation form in the chat, so please do open that up before you leave the webinar tonight. Want to thank you for your time and your engagement and participation. If you filled out that evaluation out, as a reminder, we do have a raffle that we're going to draw names from at the end of the week, so you have a chance to win a prize if you fill that out. I want to thank Zuri, Laurel, and Kelson again so much for your time and your wisdom and your thoughts and your expertise. I love this conversation. I hope that we get to continue having it year after year. And for participants, just a reminder, we have a couple days left of WPLI, a great panel on cultural strategy and cultural change tomorrow evening, and then 2 skills-based workshops on Saturday around running for office and telling your story. So hope you'll join us for those as well. And information on those panels and resources that were mentioned here tonight are on our website at montanawomenvote.org. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.